To give context for the World War II internment camps and Fred Korematsu, the U.S. joined World War II in December 1941 after the Pearl Harbor attacks. The U.S. had remained neutral until then, but after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. joined the Allied powers alongside major countries like England and France. Later on in 1945, the U.S. bombed Hiroshima, then bombed Nagasaki 3 days later, and during the time of the war, Franklin D. Roosevelt was president, but he passed away shortly before the bombing, and so Harry Truman was the one that made the decision to bomb Hiroshima.
Okay. So, I of course, I told you I researched the Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu versus the United States. So the background is that during World War II, like Americans displayed relatively little hostility toward Germans and Italian Americans, unlike before during the World War One. They seemed to share the view of the government's propaganda, which is that the enemy was less the German and Italian people than the vicious political systems to which they had succumbed. And the Japanese, both government and private propaganda, encouraged Americans to believe were devious and cruel people. The attack on Pearl Harbor, without declaration of war, it was like a surprise attack, validated this view. And there was like this anti-Japanese prejudice forming as a result. And those Japanese lived in like insular and like close communities in California area on the west coast. And about a third of them were unnaturalized and like first generation immigrants. Called Issei. It means one, and Sei means generation. And 2/3 were naturalized or native born citizens of the United States, which is like Nisei. It's like Ni is like two and Sei is like of course generation. And many white Americans continue to consider Asians so foreign that they could never become real Americans. And the close Japanese and Chinese communities further validated this view. So basically the Chinese town, like Chinatown and the communist Japanese Americans formed to live among themselves were like further exacerbated this spread of this prejudice. And the cause of internment, so baseless rumors and conspiracies circulated about how the Japanese in Hawaii had helped sabotage the Pearl Harbor and how Japanese Americans in California were conspiring to aid an enemy landing on the Pacific coast. There's a book written about this called Farewell to Manzanar. It's about Japanese American internment. And it talks about how like the government officials like assumed that the main character's father, the narrator's father, helped assisted the Japanese Empire in attacking when they were planning to attack the Pearl Harbor. Like they thought he was some sort of an intelligence related person from Japanese Empire, but of course it was like baseless. And this kind of rumors were like had absolutely no evidence, and most of them were not true at all. But the U.S. government did take it seriously, and because of the public opinion and other stuff, and General John L. DeWitt, the senior military commander on the West Coast, claimed to have no confidence in Japanese American loyalty or whatsoever. And relocation centers in February 1942, in response to such pressure from the public, the President FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, authorized the army to relocate the Japanese Americans. He created something called government agency called WRA, which is War Relocation Authority, to manage the project. So more than 100,000 Japanese Americans were relocated and were infringed upon their rights to property. Conditions in the internment camps were not brutal. They had everything they needed, but the problem was it was still like very harsh and uncomfortable. And even Governor of Utah even wanted to use Japanese Americans as forced laborers, but he, of course, that one was rejected. But still, it shows how Americans perceived, like white Americans and other Americans, perceived Japanese Americans following the Pearl Harbor. And this is like these are some images of relocation centers. As you can see, they are the conditions. The camp you can see behind isn't that great. It's just like a basic hut. And like the second image is like when Japanese Americans, apparently it seems that Japanese Americans are being taken away. Like they're being taken to the relocation centers. and they were in the process. I think I'll mention it later, but in the process, they were forced to abandon both of their property, and like they were only given the limited amount of property they are allowed to keep, and that was barely none, basically none. And basically, and the important thing is to note is that like America was like founded upon the founding fathers' idea that right to life, liberty, and property must be must not be infringed, that it's natural right, and yet they are obviously infringing upon the right to property and also liberty. So this is such a very anti-American behavior, and it can also be argued that it is unconstitutional, and yet as I will discuss later, the Supreme Court just actually decided to declare constitution that this is on the measure they took, the WWII is like constitutional. And this is like the image of some the posters that the WRA produced, the WRA produced. So as it said, as you can see, it says instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. So basically it means that whether or not you're you're an American citizen, if you're Japanese by blood, then you must be relocated and isolated from the rest of the American community in the middle of nowhere, like Utah and like those areas, like many American, like white Americans did to Indians like 100 years ago. And yeah.
Some background on Fred Korematsu. He was born in Oakland, California in 1919, and he was the third of four sons to Japanese immigrant parents, and they ran a floral nursery business in Oakland. He had undergone plastic surgery with the intent to change his appearance so that he wouldn't be a subject of ostracism in the East, and Korematsu later said that the surgeon didn't really make too many changes. They just fixed his broken nose and they didn't alter his eyelids, which is a major component and major facial feature of Asian Americans. Not having that double eyelid is kind of a giveaway that someone is Asian. And so that is also an important fact. So what happened with Fred Korematsu and why his case is so big? He was walking down a street in California with his girlfriend Memorial Day weekend of 1942, and a police officer arrested him in suspicion that he was Japanese. And 3 weeks prior to this, the U.S. Army had ordered that all persons of Japanese ancestry out of the Bay Area of California was to be sent to concentration camps. And so the military was rounding up every Japanese American and Japanese immigrant on the West Coast. And there was approximately 110,000 people. Most of them were American citizens, and they were all put into concentration camps. This act was authorized by FDR, but Fred Korematsu refused to comply with the order, which is why 3 weeks later, after the order was issued, he was walking with his girlfriend. When the police arrested him, Korematsu told the police that his name was Clyde Sarah. He had made up an American name. And he also told them that his parents were of Spanish and Hawaii ancestry and that they had died in a fire. But his story had some few holes, and he later told the police that his real name was Fred Korematsu and that his family was Japanese and that they were put in a relocation camp.
So Korematsu versus US, this is the Supreme Court case. So on December 18th, 1944, a divided Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the detention was a military necessity, not based on race. They also gave the justices also gave the constitutionality to the relocation project. So in another case the same year, it barred the internment of the loyal citizens, but left the interpretation of loyal to the discretion of the government, which obviously wasn't in favor of the Japanese Americans. And eventually, by 1945, the Japanese Americans were allowed to return to the West and California. Aftermath is that in 1988, like which was like 40 years after the war, like Japanese Americans were sued and then won some compensation for their losses. when after years of agitations by survivor of the camps and their descendants, Congress voted to award them for reparations, and they got it, but it was like, of course, too late, and like it's definitely not enough for to compensate for such a horrific event that Japanese Americans had to go through, and most of them were already dead. So it was like basically meaningless, not meaningless, but had much less meaning. Yeah.